They marched through ice and mud, men, women, and children, with soldiers at their backs. Some carried what little they owned, others carried the dying. Along the way, thousands would never see their homes again. This was not a battle. It was not a war. It was an order from a nation that called itself free. This is one of history's darkest journeys, and one the world must never forget. You're watching Forgotten Chronicle HQ, uncovering the stories time tried to erase. After the American Revolution, a young United States dreamed of expansion. Politicians spoke of manifest destiny long before the phrase even existed, the idea that white settlers were destined to stretch from coast to coast. By the early 1800s, the fertile lands of the Southeast were home to thriving native nations: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. They were called the Five Civilized Tribes, not because they lacked civilization before, but because they had adopted many aspects of American society. They built schools, printed newspapers, established courts, and even wrote constitutions. The Cherokee capital of New Echota had its own printing press and bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. But to the American government, none of this mattered. The land they occupied, nearly 25 million acres across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, was too valuable. Cotton was king, and the South wanted more of it. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected president, a war hero to some, but to native nations, he would become a symbol of betrayal. Jackson believed the only solution to what he called the Indian problem was removal, pushing native nations west of the Mississippi. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, giving the federal government power to negotiate treaties for land exchange. Supporters called it voluntary, but everyone knew the truth. It was forced displacement disguised as diplomacy. The Cherokee fought back in court. In the landmark 1832 case, Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that native nations were sovereign and that Georgia's laws had no authority over Cherokee territory. But President Jackson allegedly sneered. "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The message was clear. The law might favor the Cherokee, but the army favored the president. By 1835, the U.S. government needed a treaty to make the removal legal. When the Cherokee leadership refused, a small, unauthorized faction, the Treaty Party, signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi for $5 million and Western Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The Cherokee Nation overwhelmingly rejected it. Over 15,000 people, nearly the entire population, signed a petition against it. But the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty by just one vote. In 1838, the deadline to leave passed. Only a few hundred Cherokee had relocated voluntarily, so General Winfield Scott was ordered to enforce the removal by force. Federal troops, aided by state militias, surrounded Cherokee towns. Families were dragged from their homes at gunpoint. Eyewitnesses described soldiers looting homes, burning villages, and driving people into makeshift stockades. Over 16,000 Cherokee were imprisoned in holding camps. These were hot, disease-ridden enclosures that started the suffering before the march even began. Dysentery, measles, and typhus spread through the camps. Hundreds died before taking their first step west. The journey spanned nearly 1,000 miles through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas to the so-called Indian Territory. They traveled in groups, each escorted by soldiers. Most walked, a few wagons carried the sick and elderly. The summer heat turned to freezing rain as the seasons changed. Roads became rivers of mud. Missionaries and soldiers left behind harrowing accounts. Reverend Daniel Butrick wrote, "We met a great many sick and dying, and numbers of fresh graves along the road. It seemed as if death followed in their tracks. Food rations were scarce and often spoiled. Blankets were few, and the weak were left behind." By the time they reached the Mississippi River, winter had set in. One survivor recalled, "We crossed on a bitter, cold day. Many of our people fell into the river and froze to death. Mothers carried infants wrapped in rags. The old were laid down beside the trail, never to rise again." By the end, around 4,000 Cherokee, 1 in every 4, had died from exposure, starvation, and disease. The Cherokee were not the only ones. The Choctaw had been removed first in 1831. An officer who witnessed it described their march as a trail of tears and death. The phrase would later define them all. The Creek followed in 1836. The Chickasaw in 1837. The Seminole resisted in Florida, fighting a bloody 7-year war before being forced west. Altogether, more than 60,000 Native Americans were displaced between 1830 and 1850. Tens of thousands never arrived, and for those who did, the so-called Indian Territory was no promised land. Tribes were placed on unfamiliar soil, often alongside rival groups. Disease and famine struck again. Still, they rebuilt, forming new governments, schools, and newspapers. Their survival itself was an act of defiance. For decades, the Trail of Tears was written off as a sad but necessary step for America's growth, a narrative that excused cruelty as progress. But history has a way of revealing the truth. This was not destiny. It was a choice, a political decision, fueled by greed, racism, and ambition. In 1987, Congress established the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, a 5,000-mile network across 9 states, preserving the roots and stories of those who walked them. In 2009, the U.S. government issued a congressional resolution expressing regret, but stopped short of a full apology. Today, the memory lives on, not just in museums, but in the descendants of those who survived. They carry the resilience of their ancestors and the reminder that survival is the ultimate form of resistance. The Trail of Tears reminds us that nations are built not only on triumphs, but on tragedies, and that progress built on suffering leaves scars that never fully heal. Yet it also tells a story of endurance, of a people who refused to vanish, who rebuilt their identity from ashes. The old people said the stars watched over us that winter, one Cherokee descendant recalled. When all else was taken, the sky was still ours. You've been watching Forgotten Chronicle HQ. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos on history that won't be forgotten.